Good afternoon and welcome to part 2 of the ALCTS Webinar two-part series on standards for collection management. I'm Allison Armstrong, a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee, and will be your host for this afternoon's webinar. Our first presenter today is Betty Landesman, the Head of Technical Services and Content Management at the University of Baltimore since 2012. Prior to that, she worked at a number of academic and special libraries in technical services, electronic resources management, collection development, and systems roles. Betty has served as co-chair on the Content and Collection Management Topic Committee of the National Information Standards Organization, NISO, since 2011. She holds an MLS from Simmons College. Our second presenter today will be Nettie Lagasse, the Associate Director for Programs at NISO since 2011. She is responsible for facilitating the work of NISO's topic committees and development groups for standards and best practices, and for working with the community to encourage broad adoption of this consensus work. Prior to joining NISO, Nettie worked at Ex Libris in a number of library and information provider-facing roles, and she holds an MILS from the University of Michigan. A few things to keep in mind for today's presentation. Today's webinar does not have an interactive chat capability. If you wish to comment on today's presentation using Twitter, you may use the hashtag you see on the previous screen. We will not be monitoring the Twitter feed. However, if you have questions for Betty or Nettie, please type them into the question box on your screen anytime during the presentation, and they will answer them as time permits at the end of the presentation. Questions which remain unanswered while we are on the air will be answered offline, and the answers will be sent to all attendees. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email with links to the recording, the presentation slides, and an evaluation within 2 days. Please take time to fill out the evaluation form, since it will be used by the committee to plan future events. There may be a slight delay as I turn the presentation over to Betty.
Hi everybody, this is Betty. I'm the person on the right on the slide that you see. My colleague Nettie is the person on the left on the slide that you see, and she'll remind you of that when she comes on as well. As a recap, during part 1 of this webinar on Tuesday, we discussed counter, sushi, seru, and transfer. Today, we're going to pick up with Kbart, PyJ, DDA, and OAI. And I promise we will explain what all these acronyms mean as we go. Kbart, Knowledge Bases and Related Tools. Kbart is a project of a joint NISO UKSG working group. Those of you that were on the webinar on Tuesday may remember Project Transfer was a UKSG initiative, and UKSG stands for United Kingdom Serials Group. Kbart is a recommended practice, and it's a NISO RP9, to provide guidance for accurate metadata exchange between content providers and knowledge base developers. So what's the problem being addressed? I freely admit I, quote, borrowed, unquote, this lovely slide from a NISO presentation at the NASIG 2014 conference, and which went into a lot more detail than I have time to do on open URL basics, but it's a great slide, so I appropriated it. A database contains information about web resources. For example, what journal holdings are available in JSTOR. It also contains information about how you link to articles in those journals or web resources and what resources a library has licensed or owns. The link resolver, knowledge base, knows what content the library can access and where. And all of this gets the users to the appropriate copy, which is the copy of the content that they can actually use. So what could go wrong? Well, the publisher might provide the wrong metadata for the title to the knowledge base. The link resolver might use bad metadata to make the link. The link doesn't resolve to the correct target. And perhaps the data is not current. For example, the issue may have been removed from the database, or the provider hasn't yet notified the knowledge base that the issue is live. So the end result is users cannot access content they're told that they have. Hence, Kbart. Kbart provides a simple metadata exchange format. Some brief examples are publication _ title, date _ first _ issue _ online. Not particularly exciting perhaps, but this is all spelled out in the Kbart document. It was first adopted as a NISO recommended practice in 2010 with a focus on metadata formatting for journal resources. It was updated in 2014 to include more complex issues in metadata supply, such as consortia-specific metadata and metadata transfer for open access publications, e-books, and conference proceedings. The full text of our RP9 is available on the NISO website at the link that is on the slide. And here it is. In addition, on this same website is a Kbart endorsement section. Now, endorsement means that the organization has agreed to format and exchange content availability data according to the guidelines. And so here are the organizations that are current Kbart endorsers are listed, as well as the rationale, the specifics of the requirements for data. It's all right there. There's also a registry, which seems to have sort of, okay, came back. Kbart registry aims to provide a list of contacts, URLs, and instructions relating to the transfer of e-resource metadata between content providers and link resolvers. And so here's a list of organizations, many of which you can see are Kbart endorsers, some of which are not, but this is information available no matter what. There's also an interest group list. This is a public email list. It is not limited to NISO people. It's not limited to the Kbart working group people. It's not limited at all. It is available for anyone to participate in to get information and discussion about the Kbart project. And all of the direct links that I just showed you are available on the slide. So moving on to PyJ. PyJ provides recommended practices for the presentation and identification of e-journals. And its formal designation is RP16, 2013. And I'm going to actually quote a whole block of text here because it's a really good explanation of the problem to be solved. This is directly from the PyJ document. Citations form the basis for much scholarly research. Connecting researchers with appropriate content is the goal of open URL linking and other reference linking systems. Two things are necessary for accurate identification. First, articles must be cited by the title of the journal in which they originally appeared, which may be different from the title the journal currently bears. Second, the correct ISSN must be used in order for link resolution to accurately happen. Until there is a consistent and universally used identification scheme for articles, and the penetration of Crossref and the DOI is far from universal, researchers have no choice but to rely on existing citation elements. So the real short version of this is that a journal may have undergone title changes during its history, but all the online content starting with Volume 1 may be listed under the current title with the current title's ISSN on the publisher's website. Now I'm going to share a true story from when I was at the NIH library in my previous position. I'm sure you have all experienced this, only we didn't have PyJ at the time. We had a mechanism for librarians or users to report a problem with getting to our online content. It was called eTrouble. And one day we got an eTrouble report from an NIH researcher who said, "This doesn't work. You say I have access to this, but I don't." Well, what had happened is that he found a really good reference in PubMed or Web of Science, clicked on the SFX button, it said we had access to it, clicked there for the full text, and was taken to a web page for a journal that had a completely different title. And he thought the link was broken. In fact, the content was there, but the title that his citation was from was an earlier title, and all the content was on a later title. And frankly, he wasn't happy. He said, "They shouldn't do that." And we said, "You're right." So PyJ was developed to provide guidance on the presentation of e-journals, title presentation, accurate use of ISSN, and citation practices. It is intended to help ensure that e-journal content can be reliably discovered, cited, and accessed over time. The text of RP16 is available on the NISO website. As are all of the recommended practices that we talk about. There are also there's a really nice brochure available in two formats that summarizes all the information, lets you publicize it. It's just really, it's really a handy brochure. This version is for online display, and there it is. And there's also a version intended to print out, and it's suitable for folding into 3 parts, so you can put it on top of your information desk or tabletop or wherever you'd like to let people know about it. And how can you participate? Several ways. You can report PyJ-related access or display problems to the publisher or provider by using this template provided for you on the PyJ website. As I said, I wish this had been available to me when I was trying to deal with a disgruntled researcher who thought we had lied to him about availability of the content. You can also join the PyJ info mailing list. This is, I hope, now a familiar refrain. It's an open list available to anyone interested in the work of the PyJ working group. It's a way to communicate regularly about the work of the group, to solicit feedback, be a forum for questions, etc., etc., etc. And the instructions for subscribing are right here on the website. So now I'm going to turn the webinar over to Nettie, who will talk about DDA and OAI.
Great, thanks very much, Betty. And hello, everyone. Not sure if everyone was on the call on Tuesday or the webinar on Tuesday, but again, just to recap, the person that you're hearing now on your microphone or your speakers is me, Nettie, and I'm on the left on this screen. So just by way of introduction. And as Betty mentioned, and Allison, I'm going to be talking to you about two other recommended practices that NISO first recently published, and then the second item that I'll talk to you has not yet been published and is actually still in the Skunk Works area of NISO. So the first recommended practice that I want to talk to you today is a recommended practice that we published in June, just before ALA, on demand-driven acquisition. And this recommended practice was in the works for just under 2 years by a working group that consisted of librarians and publishers and support providers for both of these entities. And we also included perspectives from public libraries and consortia. The idea with this work, it was that the recommendations were, from the very get-go, intended to be as broadly applied as possible. Although this is indeed an area that is undergoing a lot of changes as new models are offered and librarians are trying to figure out what types of things work best in their environment, this group took on a very ambitious charge, which was to consider the realm of demand-driven acquisition and what kinds of recommendations would they create that could be applied to both electronic material, which is how I usually think of demand-driven acquisition, but also the recommendations could be applied to print material as well. And I think it would be interesting to see a little bit down the road if libraries are actually applying these to print. I'm just curious. So one thing I want to mention about the definition of demand-driven acquisition, there is also a term patron-driven acquisition, but the group really wanted to make a distinction between PDA, patron-driven acquisition, and this term DDA, demand-driven acquisition, in that patron-driven acquisition has really that's normal library collection building. You get input from your patrons, and you determine how you're going to create your collection. Demand-driven acquisition really takes a little bit more data-oriented into account, where patrons or users can actually submit their demands and have a much more direct impact on how the collection of the library is created. So all the time I've been talking, you'll see the URL at the bottom of your screen. That is the link to the actual recommended practice that you can download. And it's, I think, a very good read. I think it's a very good orientation, particularly for librarians, about the kinds of considerations and good advice about what kinds of things to consider when building and evaluating your DDA program. And I think DDA is something that most libraries are at least trying to consider if they haven't already started programs at their institutions. So what was the charge for this DDA working group? And as I mentioned, their charge was very broad. It was to develop a flexible model for demand-driven acquisition that will work for all of the different stakeholders in the group, so publishers, vendors, aggregators, and libraries. And the kinds of things that should be included in this recommended practice model should be supportive of DDA programs that will meet local budget and collections needs, allow for consortial participation, support cross-aggregator implementation, and then account for all DDA and how DDA impacts all functional areas of the library. So that's really very broad, but as a result, when the group was first meeting and determining how they were going to attack this problem that was very broad, they split up into subgroups covering different areas, and then spent a lot of time putting together something which turned out to be quite monumental in my estimation, which was a survey. And that survey ran it must have been at least a year ago. So maybe some of you or your libraries participated in that survey, in which case many, many thanks, because I realized the survey overall, and you may know if you've ever managed surveys, it's really nice when surveys are quantitative. That is, when you ask questions where people input yes or no, and then you can tally up the responses and say, oh, 54% said this and 24% said that, and the rest said another thing. This particular survey that the group ran was really very qualitative, and it generated fantastic data, but it was a lot of comments and perspectives and opinions from different libraries. Most of the participants in the survey were libraries. There was a survey that was conducted for publishers and not quite so many participants. But the data that was generated from that survey, well, it produced a lot of material for the working group to then work through and determine from the survey data how they were going to formulate their recommendations. But the survey, which we have published, and I'll show you the URL at the end, is also an incredibly rich source of information about different perspectives from various libraries. And I think if anyone has worked in more than one library, you know that different libraries work very differently and have different histories, different values, different contexts that all plays into the picture. So hence, a recommendation that is going to cover all of these things is, by definition, very broad. So just want to sort of give credit to the group for taking a big bite of the world of DDA with even just this survey that they developed and then conducted and then analyzed. So from the survey and from the research that the group was working on, they put together their recommended practice, which is the actual publication. And the next few slides that I'm going to show you are really just an outline of the various areas of the recommended practice. And I think the most important area, and accordingly has been put first in the survey, is recommendations on establishing goals. And really everything else in the recommendation kind of falls from the goals. It's amazing that I think it's perfectly natural that many institutions will want to set something up without necessarily thinking through all of the different outputs that they'd like to see, or what are the kinds of potential impacts that a new program could have on their library. So I think the first area, establishing goals, recommends 4 broad goals for DDA. One is saving money. One is spending the same amount of money more wisely. One is providing broader access to the world of information. And then another potential broad goal is building a permanent collection via patron input. And I think each library has to determine for itself what kind of emphasis they're going to be placing on each of these areas. And then these areas then become levers, which then provide further decision-making capabilities down the road when you need to determine what content you're going to make available to your patrons, what DDA models you are going to choose, and what kinds of profiles you will provide in your program. So the choosing content to make available basically just covers different issues that come out of the goals and how these might impact what content is available. DDA models, typically the modes of possibilities for DDA include auto-purchasing material and also short-term loans. And this depends on the provider you've got and the publisher that you've got, what capabilities they provide. But then you're also going to want to make considerations according to the goals of the program, and then you've got these various models that are available to you from the different providers that you've got to choose from based on who you already are purchasing material from. And then profiling, there's broad definitions that are available in the recommended practice. I think personally, loading records and removing content, these are fairly mechanical areas of the recommended practice, but I think it's good to remind libraries in these about how obviously when you're wanting patrons to have access to records so that they can indicate their desire for particular items, it is really, really important that you have those records in all of the places where users might discover them, your ILS, your discovery system, any place where you're exposing library content to your users. And then just by the same token, removing the content when your program changes, when you're making updates. And the recommended practice, I think, provides some specific areas or areas of advice there. Assessment. Of course, everyone is going to come back at a certain point in the collection cycle and determine, well, how well is this program working for us? And this comes back to the goals you established back at the beginning and how well you wanted it to perform in the different areas that you had at your disposal at the beginning. So there's many different data sources that are listed in the assessment area of the recommended practice that then correspond back to your goals. And I think every library, as it has different goals, is going to be assessing the program very differently according to their collection, their users, and how they do their business and communicate with their users and their collection. Preservation, I think that's a very short area of the recommended practice. It essentially says books that are obtained via DDA should be preserved, and kind of puts a call onto the publishers of these materials to establish programs with locks and Portico to ensure that although these are a little bit more a little bit less defined than a typical traditional library collection, the preservation of this material is no less important than the kinds of material that libraries have always collected. And then there's areas in the recommended practice that cover consortial DDA. So if your library is part of a consortium, and you're having a discussion at your consortium about such a program, there is described particular models that might be appropriate for different types of consortia. Excuse me. And then public library DDA has almost an entirely different perspective, and in some ways demand-driven acquisition has been practiced for much longer at public libraries. In some ways their collection building practices are very different than the ones we see in academic libraries, but still DDA can apply to them. So this is kind of putting a profile on or putting a public library template on the recommendations or lens so that public librarians may also use the recommendations. So now that the recommended practice is published, what's going to happen next? Well, if you were on the call on Tuesday and you remember my slides about the process of creation of these things, then you will remember that often for recommended practices or standards, we create standing committees, and the standing committees are responsible for promotion and support of the material. So we are putting together a standing committee for DDA, and you will see updates from their work on the DDA pages. And I would also urge you to read the recommended practice if you haven't already. That's available from the NYSO website. And also linked from the DDA page is the survey, both the questions that we asked and the results. And if you really like to see how other libraries see things, this is a fantastic source of information about the world from the viewpoint of about 100 or so different libraries. And I think that's fascinating. So that's that for the DDA. The next material that I'm going to talk to you about, the next project that I'm going to talk to you about is a project that started with one name, and we now have created a different name for it. So the project that was formerly known as Open Access Metadata Indicators, if you had seen any press release or announcements about this program in the last year, that is how you might have seen it, OAMI, Open Access Metadata Indicators. This group started a little bit over a year ago to address the problem where it is very difficult for many stakeholders in the academic content creation and consumption arena to understand and make use of whether articles that they are acquiring, using, writing, publishing are available under open access means. So this group was putting together recommendations in this area, and the specific areas I'll show you on the next slide. But first, I want to enforce in your minds that the name of this group and the recommendations that will be published very soon have a new name, and that is Access and License Indicators. So the name has become a little bit more, let's say, generic, but also we hope a little bit more descriptive of the overall scope of the work. So we're de-emphasizing the open access aspect, but emphasizing whether or not the metadata associated with a particular article indicates access capabilities and license terms that are associated with that article, and that might be open access or some other license terms. So on this screen, this is really just a demonstration screen to show you the current modus operandi where different publishers may be publishing open access material as part of their subscription journals, and it's the case where each publisher has developed its own little symbols or words or indicators to show that in a hybrid situation where some material is under a subscription license and other material is under more openly available, the user has to look and see and try to recognize symbols and languages about this. So what was the problem that this working group was starting to put together or embarking on a little bit more than a year ago? Their objectives were to put together a specified format for metadata and possibly a set of visual signals. That was left there as a possible thing, which would describe readership rights associated with a single scholarly work. So primarily articles, but then also potentially book chapters or other individual elements, typically not things at the journal level or package level. And then also put together some recommendations for how publishers could publish this data and how aggregators could pick it up and further distribute it. And then also put together a report on whether or not it would be feasible to do this kind of thing. So could clear information about the reuse rights for these items be sent through the supply chain, and how these different elements could be transmitted. And then also applying how well this potential solution would apply to particular use cases. So that was a typical area of discussion among any working group at NISO when it's putting together recommended practice is to put together use cases that describe different stakeholders' requirements, desires, emphases, and so on. And these often help to measure how well a recommended practice or particular recommendations are going to apply to the groups or individuals who are hoped to be able to adopt that recommendation. So very briefly, and this is actually a very brief, these recommendations have not yet been published. They are in their final stages, and I knock on wood when I say that because I'm trying to put more time these weeks to editing and finalizing this particular document. We received a huge number of comments when we put this document out for public comment, and they have taken a tremendous amount of time to work through, argue about, determine outcomes to, and then make changes to the document. But we are hoping that these recommendations will be published within the next month. But they are essentially it's interesting for such a contentious area, the recommendations themselves are really quite brief. They consist of 2 metadata tags, and one is called the free to read tag. And you'll notice this does not say the open access tag. It's not meant to be political in any way. It's simply meant to state, is this content available to be read or viewed by any user without payment or authentication? And this includes having to send an email address as part of your agreement to read something. Can you click on a link and read the article? That is free to read. And the tag itself will simply say yes or no, and the tag free to read can include dates. So publishers could indicate embargoes for their articles as part of these tags and say it is not free to read for the next 2 years, but then starting 2 years from now or a particular date, it will be free to read, so that then this metadata, once created by publishers and further distributed by aggregators, can be sucked up by systems, and then systems can make decisions on how to use that based on what the tags say. The second tag is meant to communicate the license materials, the licenses that are associated with these articles. And the tag itself simply says license ref, and then it includes a URI that would ideally link to license terms for the particular article. And the license terms could either be human readable or machine readable. I think certainly in the beginning we're going to be seeing many more license terms that are human readable. Machine readable licenses are still quite another area of discussion, and I won't talk about that today. But this would link to a license, and it could link to a Creative Commons license if that's what the publisher uses. It could link to a publisher created license, but the license will say what the user can do with the article. And if there's a particular time period that's associated with the license, that can also be indicated in the tag. So 2 tags, that's all the recommendations. I'll just go back to that. All the recommendations consist of, and then the rest of the document, which you will see hopefully in a month or so, makes recommendations primarily to publishers about how they can create this metadata for the content and then insert it into the supply chain so that it can be circulated downstream. Back to the visual indicators, I think I mentioned that it was a possibility that the group could determine a common visual indicator, but I should report that fairly early on, the working group determined that that was a big area that they really weren't so well equipped to handle, what with all different opinions and possibilities for visual indicators. So they will recommend the metadata transfer format, and then it's up to publishers still to determine if they want to have a green button or a yellow flag or whatever it is that they'd like to use to indicate their open availability of the material. So you'll be seeing those recommendations published in the next month, and we will, of course, put out press releases and more materials on the NISO website when that comes. So that's the end of that area of work, and I'm just wondering if there's any questions that anybody has for either Betty or me, asking questions about Kbart or PyJ or the access license indicators or the DDA, or even the things that we talked about on Tuesday, if you've had time to think about those.
It looks like we've got one, and definitely put in more questions if you have them. The first question is, does RP 2014 address the quality of metadata provided by the content provider? And for example, up to now, the ebook release date has been included in the pub date field rather than the original publication date.
Yeah, that's the DDA RP, and I guess I should obviously, well, it doesn't. It doesn't talk. That was one. They did take a broad bite of the DDA world, but they were concentrating mainly on business offerings and practices rather than the content of the data. Partly because there's so much possibility there. However, I think as part of the documentation, or I know we did discuss it, that might be a potential area of future work for maybe another NISO working group. So I'm happy to talk to other people who would like to take that up as a problem space to work on particular recommendations for ebook metadata.
This is Betty, if I could chime in. Remember how Kbart was revised in 2014 to include, among other things, ebook information? And there are new fields in Kbart specifically providing fields for metadata that say date monographed published print, date monograph published online. So there's at least underpinnings to make that
that's a
possibility.
Good point, so, yep. Thanks for reminding me of that, Betty.
So we have another question. How does the license_ref tag take into account different terms for different customers, or is the tag only used for free-to-read items?
Yeah, the tag goes along with free to read. So the idea is that every article which applies to the cases of being, or basically the article data that publishers create would say free to read, yes or no. And then if it were, well, you would always have two tags for every article, free to read and license ref. Free to read yes, and then the license terms associated with it, or free to read no, and the license terms associated with it. It wouldn't, it's a good question about different terms for different customers, because I don't think that was part of the problem scope. It was simply meant how could publishers tag their articles en masse overall. I think that if you have particular licenses that you're taking up with providers for your subscription material, that's not really part of the access and license indicators area.
Okay, thank you. The next question is a question for the AOI initiative. OCUL in Canada provides a usage rights database with particular clauses for usage, copying, usage in Moodle, etc., rather than linking to a full license. Is that something you've looked at during development of the RP?
They didn't look at this kind of thing specifically, but this area of further potential rights for usage did come up in the group's discussion, and that's partly why the tag is really pretty limited. It's free to read. It doesn't say free to copy. It doesn't say free to send to a colleague. It doesn't say free to use in a classroom. It only says free to read. Can I look at it? And can I read it online? The group felt that if there were other rights that needed to be communicated, those were really going to be very disparate from publisher and part of the overall publisher perspective on licensing, and that would be better placed in the license ref area. So the license document itself will hopefully spell out any further uses for the articles. Does that answer the question? I hope.
Yeah, maybe if that doesn't answer the question, if you could.
Yeah, I know. I think I just can say a few more comments. I know that everybody is very interested in having machines kind of sweep through their licenses and pick up terms and then have more machine actionable kinds of materials. And that was something that we got a lot of comments on. But the perspective of the group is, well, that might be possible in the future. We still quite aren't there yet. And so this is meant to be one step forward in just communicating, can I read something for free online?
Great. And it looks like the question was answered. So if we have any more questions out there, if you want to put them in quickly. I had a question about the DDA survey and kind of what the breakdown was between academic and public responses.
That's a good question. It was overwhelming, as these things often are. It was really overwhelming academic libraries. There were some public librarians who responded, and I think we had to do, maybe there was this, actually, no, I'm sorry, it was a little bit of a, it was a year ago, so I'm going back into my institutional memory here. We ran a separate survey for public libraries because the questions were going to be a little bit different. So there were 2 separate surveys, but overall the responses for all the responses were much more academic library focused, or academic library responses, many more of those.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. Doesn't ONIX PL make licenses machine readable?
Yes, it does, and that is also under investigation by NISO in another initiative, and that I'd say ONIX PL I would describe that as the chicken and egg problem, where potential providers of licenses in electronic format don't want to go through the work of translating their licenses into machine readable format because there's nothing in existence that is going to suck those in and make use of them, and potential creators of such systems don't want to develop such license sucking in systems because there's no licenses to suck in. So NISO has undertaken another project that at least tries to take model licenses that are put forward by various publishers and put those into ONIX PL for potential use by different libraries, which then can change them or make modifications based on their own individual circumstances with their publishers. So yeah, maybe in the future ONIX PL could be used as a license link for the ALI work. I think it might be the future where people see how ONIX PL really takes off. And we hope it does.
Great, thank you. So it looks like that may be it for questions. So I want to thank.
So should we give Allison back the presenter rights? I think I still have them.
Oh, that's perfect. Thank you. So I wanted to show you some of the upcoming things that ALCTS CE opportunities are. And I want to thank Nettie and Betty for their presentation, and want to thank all of you for attending the webinar. I also want to thank Joseph Nicholson for providing technical support and recording it. We hope you will look for future ALCTS programs on the website listed above. Please fill out the evaluation when you receive it to help us develop more programs that you are interested in. And of course, if you are attending both parts, you only need to submit one survey. And again, thank you for coming.
Thanks everybody, and thanks Joseph and Allison and Emily and Betty.
Likewise, back to you.